Clara Whitfield did not cry when they dragged her to the altar. She had already used every tear she had the night her father died, with a lie on his lips and a debt that wasn't his nailed to his door. She stood straight. She breathed slow, and she told herself she would not break in front of them. She broke anyway the moment a stranger walked through those church doors and said 4 words that changed everything. If this story already has your heart, subscribe and follow Clara all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The church smelled like pine resin and old hymnals, and Clara Whitfield stood at the front of it wearing a dress that did not belong to her. It was Margaret Holt's dress, ivory cotton gone yellow at the hem, taken in 3 inches at the waist, with uneven stitching, because Clara's hands had been shaking when she sewed it. She had not wanted to wear it. She had not wanted any of this. But Pastor Greer had told her in the firm and gentle way he delivered bad news that appearances mattered in a situation like hers, and a woman presenting herself well showed respect for the arrangement. Clara had stared at him across his desk and asked very quietly, what arrangement? He had not quite met her eyes when he answered. That had been 3 days ago. Now she stood in front of a congregation of 64 people. She had counted them twice, because counting gave her something to do with her mind, and waited for Harlan Briggs to stop talking. Harlan Briggs was 47 years old. He owned the feed store, the Eastern Grain Lots, and a house at the edge of Coldwater Creek that people said had 14 rooms. He had been married twice before. The first wife had died of fever. The second had left on a northbound stage, and nobody in town talked about her anymore. He stood 6 feet from Clara, with his hat in his hands, and his Sunday vest buttoned crooked, and he was explaining to Pastor Greer, not to Clara, to Pastor Greer, that he was willing to take the girl, provided the debt situation was settled beforehand, and the deed to the Whitfield property transferred to his name within 30 days. The property, Harlan said, is the real asset here. The house needs work. The north fence is rotted through. But the land butts up against the creek, and that creek runs year-round. That's worth something. Pastor Greer nodded like a man in church, slow and solemn. Clara said, I'm standing right here. Neither of them looked at her. The girl's healthy, Harlan continued. I'll grant her that. She kept her father's place running for 2 years after he took sick, so she knows how to work. I don't need a China doll wife. I need someone who won't fall apart when things get hard. I am not, Clara said louder now, a deed transfer. Harlan finally looked at her then. He had small eyes, pale and flat as river stones, and when he looked at her, it was the same way he looked at a colt. He was thinking about buying, measuring, calculating, deciding. You're a woman with $40 in debt to the Coldwater Savings Bank, he said, and no land, no family, no income, and no other offers on the table. That makes you, practically speaking, a problem somebody's got to solve. The church was very quiet. Clara felt the 64 pairs of eyes on her back like a physical weight, and she thought about her father, and she thought about the letter she'd found in his coat pocket the week after he died, and she thought about how she had come to Pastor Greer not asking for charity, but asking for help, and this was the help she had received. Harlan, Pastor Greer said carefully, perhaps we might speak more gently about. I'm being plain, Harlan said. Plain saves everybody time. The church door opened. It didn't slam. It didn't bang. It opened the way a door opens when a man pushes through it, who is accustomed to doors opening for him, steady and certain, and the hinges groaned with the weight of him. And then a current of July air moved through the nave, and every candle flame leaned east at once. Clara turned. She did not know the man in the doorway. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of tall that made the doorframe look intentional, built for someone like him. His shoulders were broad under a canvas work shirt gone soft with washing, and he had a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown dark with 3 days of beard. His hat was battered brown, felt trail-worn and real. He was not wearing it like a costume. He wore it like weather protection, which was what it was. He looked at Clara first, not at Harlan, not at Pastor Greer, not at the congregation sitting in their pews like an audience at a theater. At her. And then he looked at Harlan Briggs, and something shifted in his expression that Clara could not quite name. Not anger exactly, though there was anger in it. Something older. Something that had been living in him a long time. "What's happening here?" he said, and it was not a question. His voice was low. It moved through the church the way thunder moved through mountain air felt before it was fully heard. Harlan straightened. "This is a private matter, Callahan." So they knew each other. Clara filed that away. "Private," the man said. He stepped inside. His boots were quiet on the floorboards, a thing that struck Clara later that such a large man could move that quietly. "Doesn't look private. Looks like 60 people watching you price out a woman." Someone in the back pew made a sound. "She's got debts," Harlan said, "and no prospects. I'm offering her a situation." "What kind of situation?" "A practical one." "Practical." The man Callahan let the word sit there. Then he said, "She agreed to it." Harlan's jaw tightened. "The arrangements are between me and—" "I asked the woman." He was looking at Clara again. She had not expected that. She had stood in this church for 40 minutes, and not a single person had asked her what she wanted, what she thought, what she felt about any of it. And now a stranger who had walked in out of a July morning was looking at her like her answer was the only one that mattered. Her throat was tight. She made herself swallow. "No," she said. "I did not agree to it." The silence in the church changed. "Well," Callahan said. He looked back at Harlan. "There's your answer." Harlan's pale eyes went cold. "You stay out of this. You got no business here, no stake in this town, no—" "I'm staying out of nothing." Callahan moved down the center aisle. Not fast, not aggressive, just steady, the way a man moves when he has made a decision and doesn't need to rush because the decision is already made. He stopped beside Clara, and he stood there, and he said to Harlan, to Pastor Greer, to all 64 people watching, "She's coming with me." "She most certainly is not," Harlan said. "She's got debts," Pastor Greer began. "How much?" Pastor Greer blinked. "Pardon. The debt, to the bank. How much?" $42, and— Callahan reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded collection of bills that he had clearly been carrying for a different purpose, worn soft and creased, and he counted out $45 and set them on the communion rail without ceremony. "That covers it," he said, "with interest." The church made a collective sound, a rustling, a murmuring 64 people adjusting their understanding of what they were watching. Harlan Briggs' face had gone the color of old brick. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "I just did." Callahan looked at him steadily. "You got a legal claim on her now." Harlan said nothing. "Didn't think so." Callahan turned to Clara. "Miss, you don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go. That's your choice. But if you want out of here, I've got a horse and a clear conscience and nowhere to be until fall." Clara looked at him. She had spent her whole life in Coldwater Creek. She had been born in the house her father built, and gone to school in the church she was standing in, and known every face in this room since she was 7 years old. She had planned to live here and be buried here. She had also spent the last 3 days sitting in a borrowed room above the dry goods store, listening to the sounds of a town that had known her for 24 years decide she was a problem to be solved. She picked up her bag. It was not a large bag. It held 2 dresses, her father's Bible, a packet of letters tied with kitchen twine, and a small tin box with a broken latch that held the only things she was not willing to leave behind. She had packed it 3 days ago, when she'd understood how this was going to go, because her father had raised her to be practical about things she could not change. "All right," she said to Callahan. Harlan's voice cracked like a whip. "Clara Whitfield, you walk out that door, and you are no longer welcome in this town. You understand me? There won't be a door open to you. Not one." Clara stopped walking. She turned around. She looked at Harlan Briggs at his crooked vest, and his calculating eyes, and the $42 he had been willing to pay for her life, and she felt something settle in her chest. Something that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it. The feeling of a decision that cannot be undone, and maybe shouldn't be. "Harlan," she said, "I want you to think about what you just said. You told me that if I make a choice you don't like, you'll punish me for it. You said that like it was a threat." She paused. "It's not. You've already taken everything I had. There's nothing left to threaten me with." She walked out. Callahan followed her. Behind them, the church door swung shut, and the summer heat hit Clara like a wall. Thick, golden smelling of hay and creek water and horse, and she stood on the church steps and breathed it in and thought, "What have I done?" His horse was a big gray ground-tide in the shade of the livery's overhang. Real animal, she noticed, not a pretty one, thick-boned and steady-eyed, with a rope scar on his left shoulder and the look of something that had been places and come back. "I don't know you," Clara said. "No," Callahan said. "You don't. You just spent $45 on a woman you've never spoken to." "I did." "Why?" He was checking the gray's cinch, not looking at her, running his hand along the girth with the automatic attention of a man for whom horses were serious business. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Because I know what it looks like when a room full of people have decided somebody doesn't count, and I didn't want to watch it happen." Clara was quiet. "That's it," she finally said. He looked at her over the horse's back. His eyes were darker than she'd expected up close, not black, but a deep particular gray, the color of sky before weather. "You need more reason than that." "I don't know what I need," she said honestly. "I've been in that church for an hour being told what I am and what I'm worth and what I ought to do about it. I need a minute to remember what I actually think." Something moved in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a recognition. "Take your time," he said. She took 3 breaths. "You live up the mountain," she said. Not a question she had heard of Ethan Callahan, she realized now at the edges of conversation for years, the way you heard about someone who existed mostly in rumor. The man who bought the Hendricks claim after Hendricks lost it. The man who came down for supplies twice a year and spoke to nobody. The man who, depending on who you asked, was either a hermit or a threat, or simply someone who had decided the company of other people was not worth the trouble. "I do," he said. "And you're offering me what exactly?" He straightened. He was very direct, she noticed. He did not look away or equivocate or dress things up. He said what he meant, and then he waited. "Work," he said. "If you want it. I've got a cabin, enough room, enough food. The summer garden's behind, and the cellar needs stocking before fall. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a situation where you have choices. I'd be alone with you. On a mountain." "Yes. And you think that's appropriate?" "I think appropriate is a word people use when they want to control what somebody else does." He picked up the gray's reins. "I think you just walked out of a church full of appropriate people, and you looked like you could breathe for the first time in a week. But that's your call." Clara looked at the town around her. The dry goods store where she had rented that room. The bank where the debt was registered under her father's name. The schoolhouse where she had taught reading to children for 3 years until the board decided a woman in debt was a poor example for young minds. The houses of people she had known her whole life, their shutters closed against the July heat, their lives entirely uninterrupted by hers. "I'll need to know something first," she said. "Ask. Your name, your full name, and why you were in town today." A beat. "Ethan Callahan," he said. "I came down for salt and a new axe handle. I wasn't planning on buying anybody's freedom." "But you did." "I did." She nodded slowly. She shifted her bag on her shoulder. "I'll pay you back. The $45. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to. I'm not interested in owing anybody anything I can't account for." He studied her for a moment. Then he said, "All right. All right." She walked to the horse and waited. He helped her up, one hand brief and efficient, not lingering, and then he swung up behind her, and they rode north out of Coldwater Creek without looking back. And the town watched them go from behind curtains and over fence posts and through gaps in door frames, and nobody said a word out loud because there was nothing left to say. The trail north of town was well worn for the first 4 miles, and then it wasn't. It became a path. Then a track through tall grass where the horses had beaten the way down over years. Then as the land began to lift toward the tree line, something more like intention than road, a route that knew where it was going even when a stranger wouldn't. Clara had ridden horses her whole life, but never like this, wedged between a stranger's arms on a working horse that moved like it had somewhere to be, and she held herself carefully apart from Callahan's chest, keeping her back straight, not leaning. He noticed. "You don't have to hold yourself stiff like that," he said somewhere behind her left ear. "Greystone won't spook, you can relax." "I'm relaxed." A pause. "All right." They rode in silence for a while. The July sun was high and specific, catching the meadow grass and turning it gold, and somewhere above them, a hawk was working a thermal in slow and patient circles. Clara watched it. "How long have you been on the mountain?" she asked. 6 years. "Alone?" "Yes." She thought about that. 6 years was a long time to be alone. She had been alone, properly alone, without family for 8 months, and it had felt like a kind of slow drowning. She could not imagine 6 years of it. "By choice?" she asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "Originally, yes," he said. "After a while, it becomes habit." She waited to see if he'd say more. He didn't. She filed it away the way he'd answered, not refusing, but not offering leaving space at the edges of the words that she understood was not an invitation to push further. She had known men like that. Her father had been a man like that in his own way. The ones who spoke plainly about practical things and went very quiet about the ones that mattered. "I should tell you something," she said. "Go ahead. I'm not helpless. I want you to know that. I grew up running a household. I can cook, I can preserve, I can tend animals. I can do things that are useful. I'm not someone who needs to be managed or carried." "I know," he said. She turned just slightly to look at him over her shoulder. "You know, you've never met me." "I've heard of you," he said. Clara Whitfield. Taught school for 3 years. Kept her father's farm running through 2 bad winters and a blight year. Came to a town meeting 2 years back and told the water board they were measuring the creek wrong. Turned out she was right. She stared at him. "You come down the mountain twice a year," she said slowly. "You don't talk to anybody." "I listen," he said. "There's a difference." She faced forward again and thought about that, and thought about the fact that this man who had not spoken to her before today apparently knew something about who she was beyond her debts and her circumstances. And that was strange. It was strange, and it was something, though she couldn't quite say what. The trees closed over them, then ponderosa pines big around as wagon wheels, and the air changed cooler, resinous the heat of the valley floor left behind. Somewhere to their left, water was moving fast and cold over rock. "The creek," Ethan said. "It runs year-round. There's a pool about half a mile up where it's deep enough to wash properly." "Good," she said. "I haven't had a proper bath in 4 days." "There's a tub at the cabin, too. Cast iron. Weighs about as much as a small mule. How did you get it up the mountain?" "With tremendous effort," he said. And she heard something in his voice then that she hadn't heard before, something dry and almost self-deprecating, the ghost of a humor that lived somewhere underneath all that stillness. She almost smiled. She didn't quite, but she almost did. Why, the cabin was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. Something rough, maybe something grudging, a place that said, "I don't care how things look," the same way its owner seemed to say it. But the cabin was solid. It was built with intention, the logs fitted clean, and the mortar good, with a porch that ran the full length of the front, and 2 windows on the south face to catch light. The roof was new, she could see where shingles had been replaced recently, still bright against the weathered older ones, and the garden beside the east wall was large, genuinely large, though badly in need of attention. Ethan was right about the garden. It was behind. She stood looking at it while he put Greystone in the small corral beside the barn, a structure that was, she noticed, better built than most of the houses in Coldwater Creek. "You built all this yourself," she called. Most of it, he called back. Took the first 2 years. He came around the corner of the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, and he stopped a few feet from her, and they both looked at the garden, which was overgrown at the edges, and had 3 rows of onions that needed thinning, and a situation with the squash that was going to require immediate intervention. "I've been putting it off," he said. "I can see that." I had a hard spring. She didn't ask what that meant. She looked at the garden, and she looked at the cabin, and she thought about the 8 months she had spent watching everything her father had built get stripped away piece by piece. And she thought about how she was standing now on the side of a mountain in Montana with a stranger, and a borrowed dress, and $40 of debt cleared, and no plan beyond the next 10 minutes. "Show me inside," she said. He showed her inside. It was one main room with a stone fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove. Shelves of supplies along the north wall organized, she noticed in a way that told her about him. The tins labeled in a careful hand, the tools hung in a specific order, the books stacked by size. A man who lived alone and still kept things ordered. A man for whom the order wasn't performance but habit. Off the main room, a sleeping area divided from the rest by a curtain on a rope. A narrow bed with a wool blanket. A crate for storage. "I'll sleep out here," he said from behind her. She turned. He was already moving to the fireplace, not looking at her, making it matter of fact. "On the floor," she said. "I've slept on worse. That's your bed. And you're the guest." He said it plainly, not generously, just as a statement of how things were. "You take the room. I'll be fine." Clara stood in the middle of that cabin and thought about Pastor Greer telling her appearances mattered, and Harlan Briggs telling her she was a woman with nothing to offer, and the congregation watching her with their expressions carefully arranged between pity and judgment. And she thought about how none of those people had offered her a room. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her then, direct and brief. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Wait and see if you still want to in a week." She thought that was probably fair. That first evening she cooked because she needed something to do with her hands and her thoughts, and because there were dried beans in the pantry, and onions from the garden, and a bit of salt pork that was still good, and a woman who had grown up feeding a household does not stand idle in a kitchen when there's something to be done. Ethan sat at the table and watched her work. He was not watching in the way Harlan had watched her, assessing, calculating, but in the way a man watches something he finds genuinely interesting, without being able to say exactly why. "You don't have to," he started. "I know," she said. "I want to." He was quiet. She found a cast-iron pot, and put the beans on, and diced the onions, and worked in the easy silence of a kitchen in the early evening, and after a while she said without turning around, "Will you tell me why you really left town 6 years ago?" A long pause. "I had a place down in the valley," he said. "A farm. Not big, but good land, creek-fed. I built it up over 4 years." She waited. "A man named Nathaniel Brooks decided he wanted that water. Not just some of it, all of it. He found a surveyor willing to redraw the land lines. Got the bank to call in my note early. When I went to the land office to file a challenge, I found out my deed had been amended. Someone had changed the boundaries on the original record." The beans were simmering. Clara kept her hands busy and her voice steady. "What happened?" she said. "I lost the farm." A pause. "My wife had been sick. The stress of it, the fight, the lawyers, the losing it took what she had left. She died the following spring." Another pause, shorter. "My son was 3. He's with my wife's sister now down in Colorado. I see him when I can." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara set down the spoon she was holding. She turned around. Ethan was looking at the table, his hands flat on the wood, and she could see in the set of his jaw what those words had cost him, not the telling of them, but the living of them. The years of carrying that story in a place where no one knew to ask. "Brooks," she said carefully. "Nathaniel Brooks." He looked up. "You know the name." "I found a letter," she said. "In my father's coat pocket, after he died." Her voice was steady. She had practiced this steadiness, had built it over 8 months of not being able to afford to fall apart. My father was investigating land transfers in this county, going back 15 years. He had a list of names, properties that changed hands under circumstances that didn't add up. He was a careful man. He didn't write things down unless he was sure. Ethan was very still. Nathaniel Brooks was at the top of the list, Clara said. The fire popped in the wood stove. Outside, the mountain was going quiet, the way mountains go quiet in the evening. The birds settling the wind, dropping the particular silence that isn't empty but full. The way a room feels full after someone has just said something that changes everything. Ethan looked at her across the table. Your father, he said slowly. The bank said he died of heart trouble. That's what the bank said. Clara picked up her spoon. Her hands were steady. She had learned in 8 months to keep her hands steady. I'm not certain they're right. The beans simmered. The mountain held its breath. And in the failing summer light of a high country evening, 2 people who had each lost everything sat across a table from each other and understood for the first time that they had not come to this place entirely by accident. The next morning came early and cold, the way mountain mornings did, regardless of what season it was below. And Clara was already awake when the light came gray through the window of the small room. She had not slept well, not because the bed was uncomfortable. It was, in fact, the best sleep surface she'd had in 4 months, but because her mind would not be still. It kept turning over the same facts, the way a stone tumbles in a creek, wearing itself smooth and getting nowhere. Her father's letter. The list of names. Nathaniel Brooks at the top of it, underlined twice in her father's precise schoolteacher hand, the same hand that had taught her to write before she was old enough for school. She dressed in the dark and came out to find Ethan already at the wood stove, his back to her, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done the same things alone for so many years that they required no thought. He heard her come in. He didn't turn around. Coffee's on, he said. Thank you. She sat at the table. He set a cup in front of her without ceremony and sat across from her with his own, and they drank in silence. And outside the window, the light was shifting from gray to the particular pale gold of high country dawn. And neither of them said anything about the night before, about what she'd told him about Nathaniel Brooks, or her father's letter, or the way the evening had ended, both of them going quiet at the same moment, as if the weight of what they'd discovered had pressed the words out of the room entirely. But it was there between them. She could feel it. He felt it too. She could tell by the way he was holding his cup, both hands wrapped around it, his eyes on the table rather than the window. Finally, she said, I have the letter with me. He looked up. My father's letter. The one with the list. I brought it. She set her cup down. I don't know what I thought. That it might matter someday. That it was the kind of thing you didn't leave behind. Can I see it? She went to the room, got the small tin box from her bag, came back. The latch was broken, had been broken since she'd pried it open 2 days after her father died, when she'd gone through his coat pockets the way you did when a man died and left things unfinished. She set the box on the table and opened it and took out the letter, which was folded into thirds and worn at the creases from how many times she'd opened and refolded it. She slid it across the table. Ethan unfolded it carefully. He read it the way he seemed to do most things, without rushing, without commentary, his expression still and his eyes moving slowly down the page. She watched his face. She was good at reading faces. She'd had to be growing up with a father who expressed himself mostly in silences. She saw the moment he got to the bottom of the list. His jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. He's got 6 properties here, Ethan said without looking up. 6 that changed hands through the bank, all creek-fed land. I counted 8, Clara said. Some of them are in the margin. He wrote small when he was running out of room. Ethan turned the paper over. More writing on the back, smaller, tighter, the letters crowding each other. His eyes moved. Deed amendments, he said quietly. All notarized by the same man, Warren Fitch. He was the county recorder for 9 years. Was. He retired 18 months ago. Moved to a town in Wyoming that I'd never heard of. Clara paused. The week after my father started asking questions at the land office. Ethan set the letter down. He was quiet for a long moment, and Clara watched something move through him. Not emotion exactly, but a reckoning the way a man looks when something he had half known for years suddenly acquires a shape he can see clearly. "Your father," he said. "How did he die specifically?" "Heart failure. That's what Doc Henley put on the certificate." "How old was he?" 51. Ethan looked at her. "Strong man," she said. "Stubborn man. He'd never had heart trouble in his life. Not a day." She kept her voice even. She had practiced this evenness. He collapsed in the land office. That's where they found him. On the floor between the filing cabinets with his hat still in his hand. The silence was very specific. "Who was in the land office when it happened?" Ethan asked. "The clerk said he was alone." "The clerk. A man named Tilson. He's worked there for 3 years. She paused. "He was hired the month after Warren Fitch retired." Ethan pushed back from the table. He stood up, not agitated, not performing urgency, but with the energy of a man whose mind had just shifted into a different gear and whose body needed to follow. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "I know what it sounds like. It sounds like your father was getting close to something." "Yes." And somebody stopped him. The word hung there between them, ugly and specific, and Clara had lived with it for 8 months, had turned it over and examined it and put it away and taken it out again, and she had never said it out loud to another person, because there was no person she trusted enough, and no person who would have believed her besides. "Yes," she said again. "That's what it sounds like." Ethan turned from the window. He looked at her with those dark gray eyes that she was beginning to understand held more than they showed the way, deep water looks still from the surface. He said, "How long have you been carrying this alone?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at the letter on the table between them, at her father's careful handwriting, at the list of names that had cost him everything. Then she said, "Since the week after he died, since the day I found the letter and understood what it meant and looked around at a room full of people who had already decided I was just a woman with a debt problem and realized—" She stopped. "Realized what? That nobody was going to listen to me, that a woman in my position with no money and no standing and no land was not the person who got to walk into a sheriff's office and say she thought her father had been murdered and expect to be taken seriously." Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "So I kept it to myself, and I waited. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. And then I walked into a church," Ethan said. "And then you walked into a church." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not going to tell you that what you're thinking isn't dangerous, because it is. Brooks has the bank, the land office, probably the sheriff. He's had 9 years to build walls around himself." "I know, but I've been wanting to prove what he did for 6 years," Ethan said. "And I've got the deed to my original property. The original deed, the real one before the amendment. I kept it." He paused. "I kept it because I couldn't let go of it. I told myself it was foolish. Maybe it wasn't." Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, she was too careful for hope, but the first stirring of something that might become it. "Where is it?" she said. "In the barn, buried under the floorboards." A pause. "I buried it the week I moved up here, in case someone came looking." "Has anyone come looking?" "Once," he said. "About 4 years back. 2 men I didn't know riding up the trail like they had business but no authority. They asked a few questions. I answered the ones I felt like answering and they left." Something moved across his face. "I don't think they were from around here. But you kept the deed." "I kept the deed." Clara stood up. "Then that's where we start." He showed her the deed that afternoon, digging it up himself from beneath the 3rd floorboard on the east side of the barn, wrapped in oilcloth and still legible after 6 years in the ground. She spread it on the workbench and held it next to her father's letter, comparing the boundary notations, and the misalignment was there, clear as a brand. Mark the creek access written into Ethan's original claim, removed line by line from the amended version. The handwriting in the amendment, slightly different. The ink, slightly different. And unless you were looking for it, unless you knew what the original had said, you would never catch it. But they were looking for it. "This is enough to open an inquiry," Clara said. She had her father's letter in one hand and Ethan's deed in the other, and she was comparing them with the focused attention of a woman who had taught herself to read legal documents over the past 8 months out of necessity. Not for a local court. Not here where Brooks has the judge and probably the clerk and definitely the sheriff. But for a federal inquiry, a territorial commissioner, someone outside his reach. Ethan was leaning against the workbench with his arms crossed, watching her work through it. "How do you know about territorial commissioners?" "My father was a thorough man." She set the papers down carefully. He wrote about the process in his notes. There are federal land statutes that supersede county jurisdiction. If the deed amendment involved fraud in official records, that's a federal matter. Brooks can own the sheriff all he wants. He can't own a federal marshal. Your father wrote notes beyond the letter. She met his eyes. 3 notebooks, full ones. I have them. For the first time since she'd known him, which was, she acknowledged, slightly less than 24 hours, something crossed Ethan Callahan's face that looked like pure, unguarded surprise. "You have 3 notebooks documenting what Brooks did," he said. "My father spent 14 months investigating. He was thorough." She paused. "The notebooks are in the tin box, with the letter." A beat of silence. "Clara," Ethan said slowly, "those notebooks and that letter, if Brooks found out they existed." "He didn't," she said. "Nobody in that town knew about them. I didn't tell anyone." She picked up his deed, handled it with the same careful respect she handled her father's papers. "The morning after my father died, before the bank came to talk about the debt, I went through everything in the house. Every drawer, every shelf, every coat pocket. I took everything that looked like it might matter and put it in that tin box. And then when the bank came, I cried and let them think I was just a grieving woman who didn't understand what was happening." Ethan was very still. "You were protecting the evidence," he said. "I was protecting what my father died for." She handed him back his deed. "Wrap that up again. Keep it where it is for now. When the time comes, we'll need it, where we know it's safe." He took the deed from her, and for a moment their hands were both on it, and she was close enough to see the scar on the back of his right hand. A burn scar, old and well-healed, running from the base of his thumb to his wrist, and she almost asked about it, and then she thought, there's time. There will be time. She let go of the deed. He wrapped it back in the oilcloth. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that surprised her with how quickly she settled into it. She was not by nature someone who settled easily. She had grown up in a town where she'd known every person and every routine and every variation on every season, and she'd still always carried a particular restlessness, a feeling of pushing against the edges of things. Her father had called it stubbornness. Her students had called her demanding. Harlan Briggs had called it, she supposed, a problem. But the mountain had its own pace, and something in that pace matched something in her she hadn't known was there. She woke early. She worked the garden, which turned out to be both more neglected and more salvageable than it had looked. The onion rows she thinned on the first morning, filling 2 crates with the thinnings to dry in the barn. The squash she untangled and restaked the following afternoon, discovering in the process 3 plants that had gone to seed under the overgrowth, but could still be turned, and 4 more that were thriving once they had space. Ethan watched her work with a quiet attention that she'd caught herself noticing more than she meant to. "You know what you're doing," he said on the 3rd morning, leaning on the garden fence with a coffee cup. "I told you I did," she said without looking up from the squash. "You did." A pause. "I should have done this a month ago." "Yes, you should have." A beat. "I had reasons," he said. "Everybody has reasons." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. What were yours? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "It's the same garden Margaret planted, my wife. She put it in the first spring we were up here, before everything went wrong. She laid it out exactly how she wanted it, every row." Clara looked at the garden. She looked at the way the rows were arranged, and she understood the positioning wasn't particularly practical, wasn't optimized for sun or drainage the way a purely functional person would have done it. It was arranged the way someone would arrange something they loved. There was intention in it that wasn't efficiency. "I kept it up as long as I could after," Ethan said. "But this spring I don't know. I'd look at it and I'd think about the fact that I hadn't gone to see Thomas in 8 months, and I'd think about the last time I saw Margaret's face, and I'd just go back inside." Thomas, the son in Colorado, 3 years old when he'd lost his mother, 9 now. "When did you last see him?" she asked. "November," he said. "I went down for 2 weeks. He stopped, started again. "He's a good boy. He looks like his mother. Same jaw, same way of standing when he's thinking about something with his head tilted just so." He demonstrated tilting his own head slightly, and it was such a small and unguarded gesture that Clara had to look away. "My sister-in-law treats him well. She has 3 of her own. He's not wanting for anything." "Except his father," Clara said. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest. "Yes," Ethan said after a long moment. "Except that." Clara stood up, brushed the soil from her hands. She looked at him directly. "You should go see him more. Whatever happened with the farm, whatever Brooks took from you, Thomas is still here. And he's 9 years old. Those years don't come back." Ethan looked at her. His expression was complicated, something working behind those gray eyes, some argument with himself that she wasn't privy to. "You sound like his aunt," he said. "His aunt is right." A beat. Then quietly, "I know she is." He pushed off the fence and went back to the cabin, and Clara watched him go and thought about how grief worked in some people, like water finding every crack and seeping in, and how the only answer to it was usually not less feeling, but more living, and how some people took a very long time to learn that. She went back to the squash. 4 days in, he handed her a rifle. Not ceremoniously, not as a lesson or a moment. He simply came out of the barn one evening carrying 2 rifles, set one on the porch rail beside her and said, "You said you could shoot." "I said I could do things that were useful," she said. "Can you shoot or not?" "My father taught me. It's been a couple of years." "Come on then." She expected awkwardness, expected it to feel like instruction, like the way men sometimes taught women things with elaborate patience and the unspoken assumption that they would be slow. Ethan was nothing like that. He set up a line of tin cans on the corral fence, walked back to where she was standing, and said simply, "Show me what you remember." She raised the rifle. Her grip was off. She knew it as soon as she settled it, and she adjusted, and he watched her adjust and didn't correct her, just watched to see if she'd find it herself. She found it. She fired. 4 cans. She got 2 of them clean and grazed the 3rd. "Good," he said. "I missed one. You hit 2 you hadn't touched in 2 years. That's good." He raised his own rifle. He was still for 1 complete second, the way he went still when he was about to do something, as if his whole body became a single focused point. And then he fired 4 times in the time it took her to take a breath, and all 4 remaining cans were in the dirt. She stared. "Show off," she said. Something happened to his mouth. It wasn't a smile quite. It was the suggestion of one, a thing that passed through too quickly to catch. 12 years of practice," he said. "The practice I believe. The showing off I'm reconsidering." This time, the not-quite smile lasted a full 2 seconds before he controlled it, and she thought, there it is. There's the person underneath. They went back to the cabin, and he made coffee while she set the table. And it occurred to her that they had somewhere in the past 4 days developed a domestic language of small decisions that required no discussion. He made the coffee. She set the table. She cooked. He cleaned up without being asked. She tended the garden. He kept the woodpile stocked and the barn in order. Neither of them had negotiated any of it. It had simply arranged itself the way water found a level. She wasn't sure what to make of that. She suspected he wasn't either. On the 6th day, a rider came up the mountain. Clara was in the garden when she heard the horse, not Greystone's familiar step, but something heavier and faster coming up the trail at a pace that didn't fit the terrain. She stood up. Her first instinct, and she didn't examine this too closely, was to look for Ethan. He was already on the porch. He'd heard it before her. He had one hand loose at his side in the way she'd come to recognize meant he was paying specific attention to something. The rider came into view. A young man not more than 20, with a hat that didn't fit him properly, and a horse that was tired and probably borrowed. He pulled up in the yard and looked at Ethan with the expression of someone who had ridden hard to deliver something and wasn't sure how it would be received. "Mr. Callahan," he said. "Joey Marsh," Ethan said. "You look like you ran that horse half to death." "Yes, sir." Joey Marsh glanced at Clara and away and back, and she could see him filing her presence as something he'd heard about and was now deciding how to handle. "My papa sent me. Said to tell you Harlan Briggs was at our place yesterday. Asked my papa some questions." "What kind of questions?" "About you. About—" Joey glanced at Clara again. "About whether anyone had seen a woman coming up the North Trail." The garden went very quiet. "What did your father tell him?" Ethan said. His voice was even, perfectly deliberately even. "Said he hadn't seen nothing, which is true, he hadn't." Joey twisted the reins in his hands. "But then Briggs asked about whether you'd come down to town lately, and Papa told him you came for supplies last week, and Briggs said—" He stopped. "Say it," Ethan said. "He said he was going to speak to the sheriff about a woman being taken off against her will." Joey said it fast, like a boy delivering bad news to a man he was afraid of disappointing. "He said if you had someone up here without proper arrangements, it could be considered a crime." The air changed. Clara set down her trowel. She walked out of the garden to the yard, and she stood beside Ethan, and she looked up at Joey Marsh, and she said clearly, and without heat, "I left with Mr. Callahan of my own free will, witnessed by 64 people in a church. I am here of my own choosing. Anyone who says otherwise is lying." Joey stared at her. "You got that?" she said. "Yes, ma'am," Joey said. "Yes, ma'am. You tell your father that," she said, "and if anyone asks you, you tell them I said it. Those are my words, and I stand behind them." "Yes, ma'am." He looked at Ethan. "Papa also said—" Another hesitation. "He said to watch yourself. Briggs has been spending time with the sheriff lately, more than usual. Papa says something's being arranged." Ethan nodded once. "Tell your father I appreciate the warning, and tell him I said he raised a good horse rider." Joey almost smiled. He turned his horse around and went back down the trail, and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the trees, and the silence of the mountain settled back around them. Clara turned to Ethan. "He's going to keep coming," she said. "Briggs?" "Yes. Not for me. I'm not the reason." She worked it through as she said it. "I'm the excuse. The real reason is you. You're up here with the only original deed that can prove what Brooks did to your land. If they can paint you as someone who took a woman against her will, they can send the sheriff up here. They can search the property. They can find the deed." Ethan looked at her. "When did you figure that out?" he said, about 10 seconds after Joey said the word crime. She held his gaze. "They don't actually care about me. To Harlan Briggs, I'm still just a useful problem. And if he can make me into a weapon against you—" "He will?" Ethan said. "He will." A pause. "So what do we do?" she said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured, the voice of a man thinking forward, not reacting backward. "We can't go to the county sheriff, can't go to the land office, can't go to anyone in Coldwater Creek." He paused. "But there's a circuit judge comes through Hargrove that's the next county seat 40 miles east every 2 months. He's federal appointed, out of Brooks's reach." When's he next due? 6 weeks. 6 weeks. That's enough time, she said, to go through my father's notebooks, to organize what we have, to build a case that a federal judge can't dismiss. It's also enough time for Briggs to keep building his story, Ethan said. Every week we're up here, he's down there telling people whatever he wants to tell them. Let him talk, Clara said. Talking is easy. Paper is harder. We have paper. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not softness, not admiration exactly, but something between them. A recognition of the kind you had with someone who thought the same way you did, who met a problem at the same angle. You're something, Clara Whitfield, he said. It wasn't a compliment, and it wasn't not a compliment. It was simply an observation said like a man who was surprised to find himself making it. So I've been told, she said. Usually it's not meant as a kindness. I mean it as one. She looked at him, and he was looking back at her, and the summer morning was bright and specific around them, and Clara Whitfield, who had learned in 8 months to be careful with hope, felt it stir in her chest again. Warmer this time, less tentative, like something taking root in good soil. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. But it was there, and they both knew it. Heat. That evening she spread her father's notebooks on the table, and Ethan sat across from her, and they read. They read for 3 hours without much talking, passing pages back and forth, cross-referencing the list of names with the notes matching dates and locations, and the names of notaries. Her father had been meticulous, frighteningly meticulous. She thought the way you only are when you understand that what you're documenting might be the only record of it that survives. At 10 o'clock, Ethan sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. There are 8 cases here, he said. 8 properties. Mine is the 3rd. The first 2 were before I came to the county. And the last 2 were after you left, Clara said. He didn't stop when you left. He kept going. He kept going because nobody stopped him. My father was trying to stop him. She set the notebook down carefully. My father was going to take this to a federal judge. I think he'd already written the letter. I think someone knew he had. And someone made sure he never sent it. The lamp on the table was burning low, and outside, the mountain was full dark and full summer, the sound of insects and far water, and Clara sat with her dead father's notebooks under her hands, and her throat was tight, but her eyes were dry because she had no tears left. For the part where her father died, she had used all of those up in the first week, but she still had plenty of what came after the cold, precise, patient anger that had been keeping her moving for 8 months. I want to finish what he started, she said. Ethan looked at her across the table. In the low light, his face was all shadow and angles. The scar on his jaw she'd noticed on the first day, the set of his mouth that she'd come to understand, meant he was feeling something he wasn't going to name. I know, he said. We will. It was such a simple statement. No flourish, no promise of how or when, no qualification. Just, we will the same way. He said everything like a man whose word was the same as his action, because in his life they had always had to be. Clara believed him. That frightened her slightly. She hadn't believed anyone easily in 8 months, and she wasn't sure she'd believed anyone this easily in her whole life, and she didn't entirely know what to do with the fact that she believed Ethan Callahan the way she believed in water being wet, not because she'd argued herself into it, but because the evidence was simply there. She closed her father's notebook. We should sleep, she said. We're going to need clear heads. Yes. She stood. She started toward the back room, then stopped. Ethan. He looked up. Your son, she said. Thomas. When this is done, and it will be done, you should go get him, or bring him here, whichever he prefers. But he should know where his father is. Ethan's expression did something complicated and brief, and then it steadied. That's a conversation for when this is over, he said. All right, she said. Hold me to it. She went to the back room. She lay down on the narrow bed in the mountain dark and listened to the sound of him moving in the other room, banking the fire, blowing out the lamp. Settling himself on the floor with the quiet practicality of a man who had given up his bed and wasn't going to make anything of it. She stared at the ceiling. 6 weeks to the circuit judge. 6 weeks with her father's notebooks and Ethan's deed and the particular kind of anger that didn't burn hot but burned long, and a man across the room who had spent 6 years alone on a mountain because the world had broken something in him, and who was now, for reasons that had everything and nothing to do with convenience, choosing to fight again. She thought about what that meant. She thought about what it meant that she was glad he was fighting. She thought about how it was possible to know someone for 6 days and feel more understood by them than by people you'd known for 20 years. And she didn't have an answer for that. Only the warmth of it, which she held carefully. The way you held something you weren't sure yet was yours to keep. Outside, a nighthawk called once sharp and high. Clara Whitfield closed her eyes. On the mountain in the summer dark, something that had been broken for a long time was quietly, stubbornly beginning to mend. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Clara knew it was a Tuesday because she had started keeping track of days on the inside cover of her father's third notebook, a small habit she'd developed to keep herself anchored when the mountain's sameness made the weeks blur together. 14 days since she'd walked out of that church. 14 days since Ethan Callahan had set $45 on a communion rail and changed the direction of her life. Joey Marsh brought it up the trail on a horse that wasn't as tired as last time, which meant either the news was less urgent or Joey had learned to pace himself. He handed the envelope to Ethan without a word, glanced once at Clara with an expression that had shifted somewhere in 2 weeks from uncertain to something closer to respectful, and turned back down the mountain. Ethan brought it inside. He set it on the table between them, and they both looked at it. The envelope was good paper, not the rough brown kind you bought at the general store, but the cream-colored kind that came from somewhere that had money. It was addressed to Ethan Callahan, and the handwriting was not a hand either of them recognized. "Open it," Clara said. He did. He read it twice. She watched his face, and she knew within 5 seconds that whatever was in that letter was not good, because his jaw did the thing it did when he was working against a reaction, the slight forward set, the muscle at the corner tightening. He handed it to her without speaking. She read it. It was from a lawyer. Coldwater Creek had one lawyer, a man named Aldous Prine, who had an office above the barber shop and who had Clara happened to know handled all of Nathaniel Brooks's property transactions for the past 7 years. The letter was written in the calm and formal language of legal documents, which made its contents not less threatening, but more so the way something dangerous is more frightening when it's still. It informed Ethan Callahan that a formal complaint had been filed with the county sheriff's office, alleging that one Clara Whitfield had been removed from the town of Coldwater Creek against her will, and that Mr. Callahan was hereby advised to present the said Miss Whitfield at the sheriff's office in Coldwater Creek within 7 days for the purpose of establishing her condition and the circumstances of her presence on Mr. Callahan's property, and that failure to do so would result in a warrant being issued. At the bottom, in a different ink, as if added as an afterthought, though Clara was quite sure it was not an afterthought. A single sentence: Mr. Brooks extends his regards and notes that certain matters of property documentation in Mr. Callahan's history may require review at the same time. Clara set the letter down on the table. "He knows," she said. "He knows I have the deed," Ethan said. "Not a question. Or he suspects it. Either way, he's using you to get to it. 7 days, she said. 7 days. She was quiet for a moment, thinking through it fast, the way her father had taught her to think, not starting from what she felt, but from what she knew, what she could prove, what she could act on. If we go into Coldwater Creek in 7 days, he has home territory. He has the lawyer, the sheriff, the land office. We walk in there and we hand him everything he needs to bury us. Yes, Ethan said. And if we don't go, he sends the sheriff up here. Same result, worse optics. Ethan sat down across from her. He was thinking too. She could see it, the same forward-leaning quality of attention he got when a problem had edges he was calculating. We need the circuit judge. That's our only move. But he's not due for 5 weeks. 5 weeks and 7 days is too long, Clara said. Yes. So we have to bring him here sooner. Ethan looked at her. A federal judge, she said, can be petitioned to advance his circuit if there's evidence of ongoing fraud in official records. My father wrote about that. It's in the second notebook. She was already reaching for it, flipping to the pages she'd marked with a folded corner. Here. He wrote about a case in 1881 in a county outside of Billings, where a petition with documented evidence of deed fraud was submitted directly to the Territorial Commissioner's office, and a judge was dispatched within 3 weeks. Ethan leaned forward to read where she was pointing. "We'd have to get the petition to the Commissioner's office," he said. "That's in Helena. Helena is 2 days' ride." "I know how far Helena is." "Then one of us has to go," Clara said. "With the petition and the evidence. The notebook's your deed, the letter." She paused. "It should be me." Ethan looked at her like she'd said something in a language he needed a moment to translate. "Clara, listen to me. If you leave this property for 2 days, it's unprotected. The deed is buried in that barn, and if Brooks sends someone up here while you're gone—" She stopped. "But if I go, I'm going as a woman traveling to Helena on her own business, and nobody in Coldwater Creek is looking for me on the Helena Road. They're looking for a woman being held on a mountain. A woman traveling freely doesn't fit their story." He was quiet. She could see him turning it over, testing it for flaws, and she appreciated that about him, that he didn't argue with her just because the idea wasn't his, that he actually thought about it. "You've never ridden to Helena," he said. "I've never needed to. It's not a simple road. The second day is mountain passage. There are creek crossings that run high in July." "Then tell me what I need to know about them," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The look was complicated. She was learning his expressions, learning the small differences between them. The way his silence, when he was deciding something, felt different from his silence when he was angry or sad or simply conserving himself. "No," he said finally. "Ethan, no, not because I think you can't do it," he said, and the firmness in his voice was not dismissive, but specific, careful. "Because if you're on that road alone and Briggs or Brooks figures out what you're carrying, there's nothing between you and them. At least up here there's high ground, and I know every foot of it." He paused. "We go together. We leave Greystone here with the deed hidden, take the bay mare travel light. And the property. I know a man. Cal Hendricks. He's one of the names in your father's notebook. Brooks took his water rights 4 years ago. He's got no love for Brooks, and a strong reason to want this finished. I'll send word. He'll come up and keep the place." Clara thought about that. She thought about the 7-day window and the 5 weeks until the circuit judge, and the letter from Aldous Prine sitting on the table between them with its careful legal language and its threatening postscript. "How fast can you get word to Hendricks?" she said. "I can ride down to his place tonight, be back by morning." "Then go tonight," she said. "We leave for Helena at first light." He left at dusk and came back before the moon was fully up, and she had spent the hours between organizing everything into a leather saddlebag she'd found in the barn. Her father's 3 notebooks, the letter copies she'd made in her own careful hand of the key property records, and a formal petition. She'd written herself at the kitchen table in the 2 hours after Ethan left, working from her father's notes, and the template he'd included in the second notebook, the one she was increasingly convinced he'd written with exactly this moment in mind. When Ethan came through the door and saw the saddlebag and the petition waiting on the table, something crossed his face that was quieter than surprise, something more like the expression of a man who had prepared himself to carry a weight alone for so long that finding someone already carrying part of it left him momentarily without his footing. He picked up the petition. He read it. He set it down. "Your father taught you to write like a lawyer," he said. "My father taught me to write like someone who expected to be doubted," she said, "which amounts to the same thing." He looked at her. "It's good, Clara. It's really good." She had been bracing herself. She realized for him to find something wrong with it, to take it gently from her hands and do it over himself the way men did. The absence of that hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said, "just that." "Hendricks will be here by morning," he said. "He's bringing his oldest boy. Between them, they'll keep the place." He paused. "He said to tell you. He said if your father's notebooks say what you think they say, then what you're doing is the most important thing anybody's tried to do in this county in 10 years. Clara was quiet for a moment. "He knew my father?" she said. "He said your father came to see him last fall, asked him questions about the water rights. Hendricks said your father sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours and wrote everything down and then looked up and said—" Ethan paused. He was repeating something he'd clearly been given word for word. "The truth isn't lost. It just needs someone to carry it." The kitchen was very still. Clara pressed her hands flat on the table. "That's what he said," she said softly. "Yes." She nodded once. Then she picked up the petition, folded it, placed it in the saddlebag, and closed the buckle. "Get some sleep," she said. "We ride at first light." They were on the trail before the sun cleared the mountains, the bay mare carrying them both at a steady pace that Ethan set and she trusted, because on the mountain he knew things she didn't, and she had made her peace with that, the same way she'd made her peace with him, knowing the creek crossings and the soft ground, and the places where the trail narrowed to nothing. She had not made her peace entirely with being this close to him. It was practical. The mare was strong but not large, and 2 people on one horse meant contact that the first day on Greystone had not required her back against his chest, his arms around her on both sides to hold the reins. The particular awareness of proximity that she could not think her way out of, because it was not a thought, it was simply a physical fact. She focused on the saddlebag in front of her. On the petition. On what she'd say to the commissioner's office when they arrived. "You're doing the thinking thing," Ethan said behind her. "I'm always doing the thinking thing." "There's a particular kind," he said, "where your shoulders come up about a ½ inch and you stop responding to anything around you. That's the one you do when you're working through something you're worried about." She considered this. "You've been paying attention." "I pay attention to things that matter," he said. She did not respond to that. She filed it in the same careful place she'd been filing other things. He said things that weren't declarations, but were more than neutral, the accumulation of which she was trying not to calculate because she didn't know yet what the sum meant or what she was supposed to do with it. "I'm thinking about what happens if they don't listen," she said. "If we ride 2 days and walk into that commissioner's office and the petition isn't enough. If they decide it's a county matter and send us back. Then we find another way," he said. "What other way?" "I don't know yet. But there's always another way. Your father found 8. He just ran out of time before he could use them." A pause. "We have time." "We have 7 days," she said. "That's enough." She wanted to push back on that, to point out that 7 days was not abstractly enough, but specifically tight, that the window between Prine's letter and a warrant being issued was short, and Brooks was not a man who moved slowly. But Ethan had said it with the particular quality of conviction he had, that wasn't optimism, wasn't cheerful or unfounded, but was more like the conviction of someone who had survived things by deciding that surrender wasn't an option, and then finding that the decision made firmly enough created its own momentum. She had been surviving things differently. She had been surviving by being careful, by being thorough, by making sure every step was documented and every word was defensible. Those 2 methods were not the same, and they were not opposites either, and she thought that maybe between them they covered more ground than either of them could have covered alone. "All right," she said. 7 days is enough." He didn't say anything, but she felt him just slightly settle behind her, and she understood that was its own kind of answer. They were 4 miles outside of Coldwater Creek on the eastern road that cut away from town toward the Helena Pass when they heard the horses. 3 of them, coming fast from the south, which was the direction of Coldwater Creek, which meant they had come from town and were on the same road and moving to intercept. Ethan pulled the mare up. "Don't stop," Clara said immediately. "I need to see. If we stop, we're playing their game," she said. "Keep moving. If they're going to stop us, they'll do it whether we're stopped or riding, and if we're riding, we have options they don't if we need to move quickly." A half-second pause. Then the mare moved forward again, and Ethan's hands on the reins shifted in a way she'd learned to read as readiness. The three riders came around the bend in the road. Clara recognized the first one. Sheriff Dale Curran, 50 years old, broad across the middle with a star on his chest that he wore like something borrowed. She'd known him since she was a child. He had eaten dinner at her father's table twice. He looked at her now, like she was a problem that had grown legs and needed catching. The second rider she didn't know. The third was Harlan Briggs, which surprised her less than it should have. Curran held up a hand. "Callahan, hold up." They held up. The mare sidled once and settled. "Sheriff," Ethan said, "I've got a warrant to take Miss Whitfield back to Coldwater Creek." Curran said it to Ethan, not to her. "For her own protection." Clara said, "I'm not in need of protection, Sheriff." Curran looked at her then. Something moved through his face, something uncomfortable, and she thought he knows. Not about Brooks, not about the notebooks, but he knows I left of my own choosing and this warrant is wrong, and some part of him knows it, and he's doing it anyway. That made her angrier than if he'd believed it. "Miss Whitfield," Curran said not unkindly, "this is a legal matter." "I was present at that church when I left," she said. 64 witnesses. I walked out on my own feet. If there is a warrant for my person, I'd like to see the grounds on which it was issued, because a woman leaving a situation of her own free will is not a crime in the Montana Territory, Sheriff, and you know it. Harlan Briggs moved his horse forward. "There are questions about the arrangements." "I'm not speaking to you," Clara said. She kept her eyes on Curran. "Sheriff, you knew my father. You sat at his table. You told him at his funeral that he was a man of integrity." She felt Ethan very still behind her. "My father died in the land office in Coldwater Creek 8 months ago. He died with a list of names in his coat pocket. Names of people who had their land stolen by Nathaniel Brooks through forged deed amendments and a corrupt recorder." She paused. "My father was going to take that evidence to a federal judge. He died before he could. I'm finishing what he started." The silence on the road was absolute. Curran stared at her. "Clara," he started, "I have his notebooks, Sheriff, 3 of them. I have documentation of 8 separate fraud cases. I have the original deed to Ethan Callahan's property predating the amendment that stripped his land and his water rights and left his family with nothing." She kept her voice steady and clear, the voice she'd used for 3 years teaching children who needed to understand something the first time she said it. "I am writing to Helena to submit a formal petition to the Territorial Commissioner's office requesting a federal inquiry. If you serve that warrant, you are obstructing a federal matter, and I will include your name in the petition." Harlan Briggs said sharply, "That's enough." Harlan. Curran's voice was flat, final. He was still looking at Clara, and she could see it happening behind his eyes, the shift, the recalculation, the man inside the badge doing arithmetic he hadn't been expecting to do on a Tuesday morning. "She's bluffing," Briggs said. "Callahan put her up to this. She doesn't have—" "I have everything," Clara said. "And it is all documented in my father's handwriting, which is the same handwriting on 3 years of school records and 2 years of land office filings, which makes it verifiable by any court in this territory." She looked at Curran. "My father trusted this county to be worth the truth. I'm willing to believe it still is, but that depends on what you do in the next 30 seconds. Nobody moved. A hawk turned overhead high and patient, working the thermal in lazy circles, and the road held its breath. Curran looked at Harlan Briggs. It was a long look. The look of a man deciding which side of a line he was going to stand on, knowing that where he stood would define the rest of what he was. "Harlan," Curran said quietly, "I think you need to ride back to town." Briggs's face went rigid. "Dale, I am telling you, I heard you." Curran's voice hadn't changed. It was still flat, still final. "I'm telling you to ride back to town. Brooks will hear about this." "I expect he will," Curran said. "Ride back, Harlan." Briggs's jaw worked. He looked at Clara with those flat, calculating eyes, and she met them squarely the way her father had taught her to meet things she was afraid of, and she did not look away until he turned his horse and went south hard, the horse's hooves throwing dust, and the sound of him faded down the road. The third rider, the stranger, looked at Curran. Curran shook his head once. The man turned and followed Briggs. Curran looked at Clara. He looked at Ethan. He pulled his horse sideways to clear the road. "I don't know anything about a petition," he said. "I don't know anything about two people on the Helena road." A pause. "I do know that your father, Clara, was the most honest man I've met in 20 years of this work." His voice was rough with something that wasn't performance. "Don't let them make what happened to him mean nothing." He turned his horse. He rode south. Clara breathed. She hadn't realized she'd stopped somewhere in the middle of that, but she had, and now she breathed in the warm July air and felt Ethan's hands on the reins and felt the mare shift beneath them, impatient, ready to move. "You," Ethan said from behind her in a voice that was not quite steady, "are the most remarkable person I have ever been on horseback with." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That's a very specific compliment. It's a very specific situation. Keep riding," she said. "We have ground to cover." He kept riding. They reached the pass before dark and made camp at a place Ethan knew, a small flat beside a creek where the wind came down from the north and kept the insects away. He built a fire without ceremony, and she laid out the contents of the saddlebag to check nothing had been jostled loose. And they ate dried meat and biscuits she'd packed that morning and drank creek water, and didn't say much the way people don't when a long day has used up the words. But when the fire had burned down to coals and the sky above was thick with stars, the way it only got at elevation, she said, "He's going to know we went to Helena. Brooks. By tomorrow he'll know." "Yes," Ethan said. "Which means we don't have 7 days. We have whatever lead we've built by leaving before Briggs could get back and tell him." "We'll be in Helena by tomorrow afternoon," Ethan said. "The commissioner's office opens at 8 in the morning. By 10, either they've accepted the petition or we're looking for another way. And if they've accepted it, then it's out of Brooks's reach," he said. "A federal petition in the commissioner's hands can't be buried by a county lawyer." Clara pulled her coat tighter. The mountain night was cold the way it always was, regardless of the season below. "He'll do something," she said. "Before a judge can come, he won't just wait." "No," Ethan agreed. "He'll go after what we left behind. Hendricks is at the cabin. He's a solid man. He won't be moved easily. What if it's not about moving him? What if Brooks goes to the barn?" She felt the familiar cold precision of her worst-case thinking sharpening its edges. What if he finds the floorboard? Ethan was quiet. "I thought about that," he said. "And the deed is not under the floorboard anymore," he said. She turned to look at him. In the firelight, his face was all bronze and shadow. "Where is it?" "I moved it before Hendricks arrived." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced the oilcloth packet, held it out to her. "It's been in my coat since this morning." She stared at him. "You had it on you this whole time," she said. "Yes." "Including when Curran stopped us on the road." "Yes." She looked at the packet in his hand. Then she looked at him. "If he'd searched us." "He didn't. But if he had, I know." Something in his expression was careful, not apologetic, but aware. "It was the right call, Clara. The deed in Helena with the petition is worth 10 times more than the deed buried in a barn that Brooks knows about." She thought about that. He was right. She could see that he was right, and at the same time she felt something else. Something that wasn't quite anger, but was in the neighborhood. The slightly breathless recognition that this man made decisions fast, and made them well, and hadn't told her about this one, and she was going to have something to say about that. She took the oilcloth packet from his hand. She put it in the saddlebag with her father's notebooks between the second and third ones where it fit like it belonged. "Next time you make a decision that affects both of us," she said, "you tell me." A pause. "You're right," he said. "I should have told you." She had been ready for the argument, for the explanation of why he'd been right to do it the way he did, the way men explain things they'd already decided. His simply saying she was right without caveat stopped her somewhere mid-preparation. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. The fire crackled. Above them the stars turned their slow nightly arc indifferent and magnificent. Somewhere below in Coldwater Creek, Harlan Briggs was talking to Nathaniel Brooks, and somewhere Brooks was deciding what to do about a woman and a cowboy riding toward Helena with everything he'd spent 9 years hiding. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. In the morning when we're at the commissioner's office?" She stopped, started again. "I want to be the one who speaks. I know you have more at stake in some ways, the farm, the deed Margaret, all of it." "Clara." "I'm not finished." "I know you're not," he said. "I was going to say I know. You should speak. You've been carrying this for 8 months and you know every word of those notebooks by heart. You should be the one." He paused. "I'll be right behind you. Same as always." She turned. She looked at him in the firelight. This man who had walked into a church 10 days ago for salt and an axe handle, and ended up here on a mountain pass riding toward a fight that had claimed her father's life and 6 years of his own. There was something she wanted to say to him. She could feel it, the shape of it not formed into words, but present the way you could feel weather coming before the sky showed it. She wasn't ready to say it yet. She wasn't sure he was ready to hear it. But it was there between them, the way things were between people who had found each other at the exact intersection of their worst losses and their most necessary courage. "Thank you," she said instead, "for all of it." He looked at her for a moment. The firelight moved on his face. "Don't thank me," he said quietly. "This is the most alive I've felt in 6 years. I think I owe you the thank you." Clara Whitfield looked at Ethan Callahan, and the night was cold and the stars were vast, and Helena was a day's ride away, and Nathaniel Brooks was already planning his next move, and none of that. Not one single piece of it could diminish the thing that was happening between them, that neither of them had words for yet, but that both of them knew with the same certainty they knew the ground beneath their feet was real. She lay down beside the dying fire and closed her eyes. She slept better than she had in 8 months. The territorial commissioner's office in Helena smelled like paper and old wood, and the particular staleness of a room where important things happened slowly, and Clara stood in the middle of it with her father's saddlebag over her shoulder, and her back straight, and her heart moving faster than she would have liked. The man behind the desk was named Arthur Gaines. He was 60 thin, with spectacles he kept pushing up his nose and the expression of a man who had seen everything and been surprised by very little of it. He had a deputy beside him taking notes and a clerk by the window who kept looking at Clara and then at Ethan and then back at his papers with the nervous energy of someone who had not expected his morning to be interesting. Gaines read the petition in full. He did not rush. He turned pages with the deliberate care of a man who understood that speed was not the same as thoroughness, and Clara stood and let him read and did not say a word, because she had learned from her father that the most powerful thing you could do when you'd prepared well was to let the work speak. Ethan stood beside her, slightly behind his hat in his hands. He hadn't said anything since they'd walked in. He was doing the thing he did, holding himself still, being present without crowding, giving her the room she needed. She had not thanked him for it. She would later. Gaines reached the last page. He set the petition down. He looked at Clara over his spectacles. "You wrote this yourself," he said. "Yes, sir." "From these notebooks." He glanced at the 3 notebooks on his desk, which she had placed there at the start, with the deed on top, like a offering. Like everything she had, because it was. "Yes, sir. My father compiled the evidence. I organized and documented it for the petition." "Your father." Gaines picked up the second notebook, opened it to the page she'd marked, read the passage she'd marked. "James Whitfield, he was a school teacher for 22 years, and he died 8 months ago, in the county land office, of what was recorded as heart failure." She paused. She had decided on the road to Helena that she would say what she believed without the softening she'd been using for 8 months to make it easier for people to hear. "I believe he was killed, Mr. Gaines. I cannot prove it in a court of law today." What I can prove with what is on your desk is that Nathaniel Brooks has been committing systematic deed fraud in Coldwater Creek County for 9 years, that a county recorder falsified official documents on his behalf, and that my father was documenting that fraud when he died. Mental. The room was quiet. Gaines looked at Ethan. And you're Callahan. Your property is case number 3. Yes, sir, Ethan said. The deed you brought is the original. Yes, sir. Pre-amendment, dated March 1877. The amendment, the fraudulent one, is dated 8 months later after I'd already lost the legal challenge in the farm. You kept the original deed for 6 years. I kept it because I knew what had been done, and I couldn't prove it yet. Gaines was quiet for a moment. He pushed his spectacles up. He looked at his deputy, who had stopped writing and was reading over his shoulder with the expression of a man who had also not expected his morning to be interesting. Miss Whitfield, Gaines said. Sir. What you are describing, if documented to the standard required for a federal inquiry, would be one of the more significant cases of land fraud this territory has seen in a decade. I know, sir. It would also, Gaines said carefully, put you and Mr. Callahan in direct conflict with a man who has, according to your own documentation, already eliminated at least one person who got this close. Clara kept her eyes on his. I know that too. Gaines was quiet for another moment. He was not a man she could see who made decisions lightly or quickly, and she respected that. Even as she felt the clock running in the back of her mind, Harlan Briggs riding back to Brooks last night, Brooks deciding what to do, the warrant still technically active in Coldwater Creek. What you're asking for, Gaines said, is an advance of the circuit schedule, a federal judge dispatched to Coldwater Creek before the scheduled date. Yes, sir. I can do that, he said. Clara breathed. I need 3 days to arrange it, Gaines continued. Judge Harrow is currently in Billings. I can have him in Coldwater Creek by Friday. He looked at her steadily. Can you be there Friday? Yes, she said. We'll be there. I'll also be issuing a federal hold on any property transactions in Coldwater Creek County pending the inquiry. That means Brooks can't move anything, sell anything, or transfer anything while the case is under review. He paused. He'll know about the hold within 24 hours. By the time you get back to Coldwater Creek, he'll know you were here. Good, Clara said. Gaines looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but a recognition, the look of a man who had seen many people walk through that door over the years, and could tell the difference between the ones who were right and the ones who were going to be effective, and was reassessing which category she fell into. Your father, he said, would have been glad to know you finished this. Clara's throat tightened. Just once. She controlled it. Yes, sir, she said. I believe he would have. They were back on the road within the hour. Ethan said nothing about what had happened in the commissioner's office until they were clear of Helena and the road had opened up into the wide pass country, and then he said simply, You were extraordinary in there. I was prepared, she said. Same thing sometimes. She shook her head. It's not the same thing. Prepared is what my father was. He was prepared for 9 years, and it still wasn't enough because he was alone. She paused. Being prepared and having someone beside you is different. He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, it is. They rode. The July sun was overhead and specific, and the road was empty in both directions. And Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety exactly, but the thing adjacent to it, the feeling of having done what you could do, and done it well, and now waiting for the world to respond. It was the waiting part she'd always struggled with. Ethan? She said. Yeah, when this is done. When the judge has heard the case, and the inquiry is filed, and Brooks has been dealt with. She paused. What do you want? Not for Thomas, not for the farm. For yourself. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. I've been thinking about that, he said. For the first time in a long time, I've been thinking about what I want instead of just what I have to do. He paused. I want to build something that lasts. Not just the cabin, not just the land. Something that—" He stopped. "Something that—" "What?" "Something that means I'm still here," he said. "That I'm not just surviving the years until I can see Thomas again. That there's a reason to build." Clara felt the weight of what he hadn't said pressing against the edges of what he had. "There is a reason," she said quietly. He didn't answer that. But his arms tightened just slightly around the reins, and she felt it, and she thought that some things didn't need to be said to be understood. They were 12 miles from Coldwater Creek when the second group of riders found them. Not from the south this time. From the east, cutting across the open ground off the road, 4 riders coming hard and deliberate, and Clara felt Ethan's body change behind her. Not tense, not afraid, but shift into that particular readiness she'd learned to recognize, the absolute focus of a man whose instincts were calibrated for exactly this. "4," she said. "I see them." "Do you know them?" "One of them," he said. "Far left. That's Cole Briggs, Harlan's nephew. The others are hired, I'd guess. Not from around here." "Brooks hired them." "Almost certainly." They didn't stop riding. She had learned from the encounter with Curran that stopping was a concession, and she was done making concessions. Cole Briggs was 25, and had the particular arrogance of a young man who had grown up around power and confused proximity with ownership. He pulled his horse across the road in front of them with the confidence of someone who expected the mare to stop. The mare stopped. Ethan had pulled her up, but not for Cole Briggs. Clara could feel that in how he did it, the quality of the stop controlled and chosen and not compelled. "Callahan," Cole said. He looked at Clara like she was a figure in a story he'd been told and was now deciding how to rewrite. "Miss Whitfield, you've been to Helena." "That's not a question," Ethan said. "No," Cole agreed. "It's not. Mr. Brooks thought you might have taken a ride that direction. He wanted me to ask you to come talk to him before this goes any further." "Before what goes any further?" Clara said. Cole looked at her. He was not an unintelligent young man, which made him, she thought, more dangerous than a stupid one. "Whatever you think you've got in that bag, Miss Whitfield. Whatever story you think you've put together." He paused. "Mr. Brooks is a reasonable man. He's willing to discuss arrangements." "Arrangements," she said flatly. "Settlements. Compensation." Cole said it like he was offering something generous. Whatever the Whitfield estate is claiming in terms of the land matters, there might be room to negotiate. And Mr. Callahan's original property there might be something to be done about restoring a portion. "Stop," Ethan said. Cole stopped. "You can go back to Brooks," Ethan said. "And you can tell him that the petition has been filed with the Territorial Commissioner's office in Helena, and a federal hold has been placed on all property transactions in Coldwater Creek County pending inquiry. You can tell him that a federal judge will be in Coldwater Creek on Friday. And you can tell him that the only arrangement we're interested in discussing happens in front of that judge." Cole's expression shifted. The confidence cracked just at the edges, and underneath it, Clara saw what she'd expected, the look of a young man who had ridden out here believing his employer's name was still a wall. Nothing could get through, discovering that the wall had a door and the door was already open. "You don't understand what you're doing," Cole said. It came out less like a threat than like a genuine statement of disbelief. "Brooks has handled bigger problems than you. He has handled judges. Not this one," Clara said. "Judge Harrow is appointed directly by the Federal Territorial Office. He doesn't know Nathaniel Brooks. He's never been to Coldwater Creek, and he has no reason to do anyone in this county any favors." She looked at Cole steadily. "Your employer has had 9 years of handling things his way. That's done now." The 4 riders looked at each other. It was a small look, quick, the kind that passed between men who had been hired for intimidation and were recalibrating what the job actually required. "Ride back, Cole," Ethan said. "Take your men. Tell Brooks what we told you." Cole Briggs looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked past them at the road at the direction of Helena they'd come from, as if he was calculating something, and finding the numbers didn't work the way he'd expected. He turned his horse. He rode east. The 3 hired men followed him. Clara let out a breath. "That's twice," she said. Third time's the one to worry about, Ethan said. He'll send someone less interested in talking. Then we don't give him time to. She straightened. How far to Coldwater Creek? 2 hours. Then ride. He rode. They came into Coldwater Creek at dusk, and the town looked the way it always looked at the end of a summer day. The same streets, the same storefronts, the same houses with their lights coming on. But it felt different to Clara. The way a place feels different when you've left it and come back changed, when the sameness of it is the thing that's strange rather than the thing that's familiar. She had grown up here. She had been a daughter here, a teacher here, a woman with debts and no prospects and a problem to be solved. She had walked out of a church here 14 days ago with a bag over her shoulder and a tin box with a broken latch and everything she was not willing to leave behind. She was not the same woman who had left. She knew it, and some part of her that she hadn't expected to feel pride felt it anyway, and she held it quietly the way she held most things that mattered. Ethan pulled the mare up at the edge of the main street. He sat still for a moment, looking at the town. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I haven't been in this town in 6 years," he said. "I didn't miss it." "I know." She paused. "But it's ours to finish in." He moved the mare forward. The first person who saw them was Mrs. Aldridge, the seamstress who was closing her shutters for the evening. She looked, and then she looked again, and then she left the shutters half closed and went inside, which meant the news was already moving. In a town this size, news always moved faster than horses. By the time they reached the livery, there were already 3 people on the main street watching them, with the careful non-expression of people who were collecting information. Clara recognized them all. She nodded to each of them as if she were simply returning from an ordinary errand. She had decided somewhere on the road that she was done being apologetic about existing. She had spent 24 years in this town, being careful about how she held herself, what she asked for, who she was in public, and it had not protected her from any of the things she'd feared. Caution had its place. But she was walking back into Coldwater Creek with a federal inquiry behind her and a federal judge coming on Friday, and she would walk straight. Ethan was beside her. He had not changed in the past 3 days. Same battered hat, same canvas shirt, same quiet way of moving, but something was different about how the town looked at him. She noticed that. Some of the men on the street who recognized him didn't look away, or didn't look away first. They went to the hotel. The owner, a wide man named Farrell, who had always been, in Clara's experience, a man who put his money where the wind was blowing, looked at them across his desk with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Miss Whitfield," he said carefully. "Mr. Farrell, 2 rooms, please. We'll be here through Friday." A pause. Farrell looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him with the particular quality of stillness that Clara had come to understand was its own kind of statement. "2 rooms," Farrell said. "Yes, ma'am." He gave them the keys without another word. The knock on her door came at 9 o'clock. She was not asleep. She had not expected to sleep too much, moving in her head. The commissioner's face. Cole Briggs on the road. The count of days to Friday. And she was sitting at the small desk in her room, going through her father's notebooks one more time, making sure she hadn't missed anything when the knock came. She opened the door with her hand on the frame ready. It was Sheriff Curran. He had his hat in his hands, which meant he had come without authority as a man rather than a badge, and that told her something before he spoke. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "I heard you were back." "News travels," she said. "Can I come in?" She considered him. She thought about who he was. The man who had cleared the road for them, and also the man who had been carrying a warrant, and also the man who had eaten at her father's table twice, and also the man who had allowed 9 years of Brooks's influence to sit in his county without formally challenging it. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He sat where she gestured in the chair by the window, and she sat on the edge of the bed and waited. "I sent a wire to the commissioner's office this evening," Curran said, "confirming the warrant was based on false testimony. I also submitted a statement that you left Coldwater Creek voluntarily and freely witnessed by myself and 2 deputies. He paused. The warrant is withdrawn. She had expected this less than she had expected almost anything else he might have said. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. He said in almost exactly the same tone Ethan used when she thanked him for something, and the similarity was striking enough to be almost funny if she hadn't been too tired for humor. I should have done it sooner. A lot of things should have been done sooner in this county. He looked at his hat. I want you to know I didn't know about your father. Not the specific thing you described. I knew Brooks had arrangements, with the bank, with Prine. I knew things didn't always sit straight, but I didn't know about your father. Clara looked at him carefully. Do you believe me about how he died? A long pause. I believe your father was a healthy man who died too young in a room alone with someone on Brooks's payroll, Curran said. I can't prove what that means, but I believe it. He met her eyes. I'm going to make sure Judge Harrow knows about it, all of it. Whatever I can put into a formal statement, I will. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the desk was burning low, and the town was settling into its night sounds outside the window, and Clara Whitfield sat in a hotel room in the town that had cast her out and felt something she hadn't felt in 8 months. Not relief, not victory. Something quieter. Something that felt like her father's hand on her shoulder, the way he used to stand behind her when she was learning something new and difficult, not guiding her hands, but simply present, letting her know she wasn't working alone. He would have appreciated that, she said. My father. James was a good man, Curran said. The best kind. The kind that can't let a wrong thing alone. He stood up, put his hat back on. I'll see you in court Friday, Miss Whitfield. You will, she said. He left. She sat for a long moment after the door closed. Then she went to Ethan's room and knocked, and when he opened it, she said, Curran withdrew the warrant. He's going to testify. Ethan stared at her. He submitted a statement to the commissioner's office, she said. He's putting it in writing. Curran, Ethan said. Curran. Something moved through his face, the particular expression of a man recalibrating something he'd written off as impossible. I've been wrong about people before, he said slowly. Usually in the other direction. People surprise you when they have something to lose, Clara said. And when someone shows them clearly which way the wind has changed. She paused. I think you and I showing up in this town together tonight was part of that. They needed to see that we weren't running. He looked at her. You never ran. I left. That's different, he said. You left so you could come back with something that mattered. That's not running. That's strategy. She stood in the hallway of the hotel in a town that had spent 14 days deciding she was nothing, and she looked at Ethan Callahan, and she thought about how strange it was that the clearest mirror she'd found for herself in 24 years was this man who'd come off a mountain for salt and an axe handle and ended up here. Ethan, she said. Yeah, I need to tell you something. She had been carrying it since the mountain pass, since the fire, since the moment she'd looked at him in the firelight and known. She was not by nature a woman who said the important things easily. She was thorough. She was documented. She built her case carefully before she spoke. But she was also, her father had always said, a woman who knew when waiting was cowardice, dressed up as patience. I'm listening, he said. What you said on the pass, about feeling alive for the first time in 6 years. She held his gaze. I need you to know that's not going to go away. What's between us? I don't have words for it yet, and I'm not going to pretend I do. But I need you to know I'm not going to pretend it isn't there either. He was very still. Clara, he said. I know it's complicated, she said. I know you've been carrying things I can't fully understand. I know Thomas is part of this in ways that are going to take time to sort out. I know we've known each other 14 days, and that's... Clara, he said again. She stopped. He stepped out of the doorway, and he was closer than the practical distances they'd kept, And he looked at her with those deep gray eyes that held more than they showed, and he said, I know all of that. And I'm not going anywhere. The hallway was very quiet. Okay, she said. Just that. Okay, he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not as a gesture, just took it the way you took something you were done pretending you didn't want, and held it, and she let him. And they stood in the hallway of a hotel in Coldwater Creek with a federal judge coming on Friday, and Nathaniel Brooks somewhere in this town deciding what was left to him, and none of it touched the particular stillness of that moment. Get some sleep, he said finally. Tomorrow's going to be loud. She almost laughed. She almost did. It is, she said. He let go of her hand. She went to her room. She closed the door. She lay down on the bed and looked at the ceiling, and thought about her father, who had carried the truth alone for 14 months, and about Ethan, who had carried his grief alone for 6 years, and about herself, who had carried everything alone for 8 months, and had finally, on a summer mountain with a man who listened before he spoke, put some of it down. Not because she was weak, because she'd finally found someone worth trusting with it. She slept. In the morning, Nathaniel Brooks made his first mistake. He came to the hotel. He came at 7 o'clock before the dining room had finished serving breakfast with Aldous Prine beside him, and a confidence that had not yet processed the fact that the world had changed while he was arranging things to stop it from changing. Clara was at a table in the dining room when they walked in. Ethan was across from her drinking coffee. They both looked up. Brooks was 60, well-dressed in the way of men who spent money to look like money was natural to them, with a face that had the particular quality of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He looked at Clara. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the saddlebag on the chair beside her. He sat down across from them without being invited. Prine remained standing, his leather case in his hands, looking like a man who had advised against this course of action and been overruled. Miss Whitfield, Brooks said. His voice was smooth, practiced the voice of a man who had talked his way through a great many things. I think we should speak plainly. I've been waiting for someone in this county to do that for 8 months, she said. Go ahead. He folded his hands on the table. I understand you've been to Helena. I understand there's a petition in the commissioner's office. I understand a judge is coming Friday. He said each thing without flinching, which she gave him credit for. I also understand that whatever you believe you can prove, legal proceedings are long and uncertain and expensive, and that a woman in your circumstances might find a settlement more immediately useful than a trial. My circumstances, she said. You have no home, no income, no property. Whatever debt was cleared on your behalf. He glanced at Ethan, a quick dismissal of a glance. That doesn't constitute a permanent situation. A settlement would give you real security. Something tangible. Clara looked at him. She looked at him the way she'd looked at Harlan Briggs in the church, the way her father must have looked at deed after deed that didn't quite add up with the clear-eyed specificity of someone who was not going to be moved. Mr. Brooks, she said. My father spent 14 months documenting what you did. He documented 8 cases, 8 families who lost land and water rights through forged documents, and a corrupt recorder you paid. He died in the land office with that list in his coat pocket. She set her hands flat on the table. I did not ride to Helena and back for a settlement. I rode to Helena and back for a federal inquiry, which I have, and a federal judge who is coming Friday, and a statement from your sheriff who is testifying against you. She paused. You came here this morning because you're scared. I understand that, but there is nothing you can offer me that changes what happens on Friday. Brooks's composure held. It held the way a wall holds when the foundation has already been compromised. Everything still standing, but something wrong underneath that the surface couldn't entirely hide. You're making a mistake, he said. No, she said. You made yours 9 years ago. I'm just the one finishing the paperwork. He stood up. He said nothing else. He looked at Ethan, one long look, the look of a man recognizing someone who had been a loose end for 6 years and was now something else, something that could not be managed. Ethan looked back at him without expression. Brooks left. Prine followed, clutching his case, not looking at anyone. The dining room, which had gone very still during the conversation, remained still for another 5 full seconds after the door closed. Then the woman at the table beside them, Martha Holt, 60 years old, who had lived in Coldwater Creek her whole life and whose daughter's dress Clara was still wearing, said quietly and clearly into the silence, "Good." And one by one, like a thing that had been waiting to happen, the people in that dining room who had watched Clara Whitfield be cast out 14 days ago let out their collective breath, and the room became ordinary again. And Clara picked up her coffee cup, and Ethan looked at her over the rim of his own, and something passed between them that was not a smile, but was the architecture of one. Friday was coming, and Nathaniel Brooks had just run out of room. Friday came, the way important days always came, looking exactly like any other morning until it didn't. Clara was dressed before 6. She had pressed her second dress as best she could with the hotel's iron, braided her hair the way her mother had taught her, and sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet of early morning with her father's third notebook in her lap, not reading it, just holding it the way you held something that belonged to someone you loved and couldn't give back. She had been talking to him in her head for 14 days. Not out loud, she was too practical for that, but in the quiet spaces between decisions, she'd found herself thinking, "Is this right, Papa? Is this what you meant? Is this enough?" She thought this morning that she had her answer. She set the notebook in the saddlebag with the others. She picked up the bag. She walked out to meet the day. Ethan was in the hallway. He was already dressed, already. Still already that particular version of himself that she had come to understand meant he was ready. Not tense, not afraid, but gathered all of himself, pointed in one direction. He looked at her when she came out of her room, and he said nothing. Just looked, and she looked back, and between them passed everything. They didn't need to say, because they'd already said it in pieces. Over 14 days on a mountain and on roads and in hotel hallways, the whole accumulation of it. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They went downstairs together. The dining room was already half full, which was unusual for 6 in the morning in Coldwater Creek. Clara recognized faces. Mrs. Holt, the Delaney brothers from the grain lot, old Pete Marsh, Joey's grandfather, who had not left his house on a weekday in 3 years due to his knees. They were not there for breakfast. They were there because the word had moved through this town the way words always moved in small towns, through fence posts and window gaps, and the particular telegraph of people who had been waiting a long time for something to break open. Nobody said anything to her directly, but Mrs. Holt pressed her hand as she passed, and Pete Marsh touched the brim of his hat, and the Delaney brothers moved their chairs to give her room to pass, and it was not nothing. After 14 days of being nobody in this town, it was not nothing at all. She and Ethan ate quickly, barely speaking, and then they walked to the courthouse. The courthouse in Coldwater Creek was the most solid building in town, built from quarried stone, back in the territorial days when someone had believed this county would grow into the kind of place that needed permanence. The courtroom on the second floor had 20 seats and a judge's bench that was slightly too large for the room, giving the whole space the quality of something built for an occasion larger than the daily reality. Today, it was going to fit. Judge Harrow had arrived the previous evening. Clara had not met him yet. Gaines had communicated through a deputy, but she had learned what she could. Federal appointment, 12 years on the territorial circuit, known for 2 things: an absolute intolerance for procedural manipulation, and a memory that, according to Gaines's deputy, was the closest thing to a court record the territory possessed. He forgot nothing. He could be read back testimony from 7 years prior without notes. She was glad of that. She had brought everything written down regardless. The courtroom filled by 8 o'clock. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls. Clara had not expected that, and the sight of it, this room full of people who had not stood up for anything in 9 years, standing up now simply by being present, caught her somewhere beneath the sternum and held. Ethan was beside her at the petitioner's table. His original deed was in front of him, the oilcloth wrapping folded back, the document itself laid flat. Her father's 3 notebooks were stacked to her left, each tabbed and marked in her careful hand. The petition she'd written in this room, that version of herself 2 weeks ago sitting at a borrowed desk with shaking hands, felt like someone else's work now. Steadier work. More confident work. She had grown, she thought, since then. It was possible to grow quickly when the stakes were high enough. Aldous Prine sat across the room at the respondent's table. Nathaniel Brooks sat beside him, composed, well-dressed, looking like a man attending a social function he considered slightly beneath him. He had not looked at Clara when he came in. She had looked at him steadily and without expression until he sat down. Sheriff Curran sat in the front row of the gallery with a leather folder on his knee. Judge Harrow came in at 8:15. He was smaller than Clara had pictured, a compact man in his 60s with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of face that had been weathered into something essential, all the unnecessary parts worn away. He moved like someone who had no time for theater and intended to make that clear from the first moment. He sat. He looked at the room. He looked at Clara with the same attention he gave everything specific, direct, without performance. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "you filed the petition." "Yes, Your Honor." "You wrote it yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Commissioner Gaines tells me it's one of the more thorough documents that's crossed his desk in a decade." He said it without warmth, as pure information. "We'll see. Begin." Clara stood up, and she began. She spoke for 40 minutes without stopping. She had not planned to speak for 40 minutes. She had planned to be concise, to present the evidence in order to let her father's notebooks carry the weight. But the room was so full and so still, and Judge Harrow's attention was so absolute, and the story was so long and had cost so much, that she found herself telling it the way it needed to be told from the beginning, from the farmhouse where Cal Hendricks had lost his water rights, from the land office where her father had first noticed the discrepancy, from the schoolroom where she had taught the children of families that were losing their land and hadn't been told why. She told it plainly. She did not embellish. She did not soften. She used her father's words where she had them and her own where she didn't, and she cross-referenced every claim with a document, a notebook page, a deed. When she set Ethan's original deed on the judge's bench alongside the amended copy she'd obtained from the county records, 2 documents side by side. The handwriting, different, the ink, different, the boundary. Language changed in ways that stripped a creek from a man's property and gave it to someone who had paid to have it given. Judge Harrow looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Mr. Prine." Prine stood. He was a man who had spent his career making bad things look procedurally sound, and he was good at it. And Clara watched him do his best version of it, now challenging the chain of custody of the notebooks, questioning the provenance of the original deed, suggesting that the boundary discrepancy could be explained by surveying error. He was good. She had expected him to be good. She had also prepared for him to be good. "The surveying error argument," she said when Harrow turned back to her, "is addressed in my father's second notebook, pages 41 through 44. He consulted 2 independent surveyors. Both confirmed the creek boundary in the original deed. He has their names, their dates of consultation, and their written assessments all reproduced in the notebook." Prine said, "Those assessments are—" "The surveyors are still alive," Clara said. "Both of them. One lives in Billings, one in Missoula. The commissioner's office has their contact information." She looked at Harrow. "Your Honor, my father was a thorough man. He knew he was building a case that would be challenged. He documented accordingly." Harrow looked at Prine. Prine sat down. That was the first moment Clara knew they had won. Not the case would take weeks, possibly months of formal proceedings. But this hearing this Friday morning, this room full of people who had needed to see something break open. She knew they had won this part. She sat down. Ethan's hand found hers under the table. Brief, sure, there and then gone, the way he did everything without theater. And she held it for exactly 1 second, and then let go, because there was still more to do. The second twist came from a direction no one had expected. Curran had been sitting in the front row for 2 hours with his leather folder, and Clara had assumed he would be called as a witness in the standard order, that his testimony would be one piece among many important, but not decisive. But when Harrow called him forward, and Curran opened the folder, what came out was not the statement Clara had expected. It was a second document. Curran set it on the judge's bench, and said in the measured voice of a man who had been deciding something for a very long time, and had finally decided, "Your Honor, this is a record from the county coroner's office. It pertains to the death of James Whitfield 8 months ago." The room changed. Clara went very still. "When Miss Whitfield returned to Coldwater Creek 2 days ago," Curran said, "and told me directly what she believed about her father's death, I went to the coroner's office that night, not the current coroner. The previous one, Doc Henley, retired 4 months ago, moved to his daughter's place outside of town." He paused. "I drove out there Wednesday evening. I asked him to walk me through the Whitfield examination." Prine was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is entirely outside the scope." "Sit down, Mr. Prine," Harrow said. Not loudly, just finally. Prine sat. "Doc Henley," Curran continued, "told me something he hadn't put in his official report. He told me that when he examined James Whitfield, there were signs inconsistent with natural cardiac failure, bruising at the wrists, ligature marks faint but present." His voice stayed even. Clara understood it was costing him to keep it even. "He told me he'd written heart failure on the certificate because he was scared. Because 2 days before your father died, Miss Whitfield, Doc Henley had received a visit from a man he recognized as one of Brooks's hired hands, who had mentioned in passing that the doctor had a wife and 3 children, and that Coldwater Creek was a safe town, as long as people were sensible about what they saw and didn't see." The room was so quiet, Clara could hear her own heartbeat. She did not cry. She had no tears for this part, she'd known that. But she had not expected the specific quality of grief that moved through her. Now not surprise, not shock, but the terrible, sad relief of a thing confirmed, of a question you'd been carrying. Answered at last, of being right about something you'd given anything not to have been right about. Her father had not had a heart attack. He had been murdered. And in front of a federal judge with a retired coroner's account in hand and a sheriff testifying against the most powerful man in the county, that fact was now part of the official record. Ethan's hand was on the table beside hers. Not touching, just there. She put her hand over his. She kept her eyes on Judge Harrow. Harrow recessed for 20 minutes and came back with the expression of a man who had formed conclusions and was going to state them without ceremony. "I am issuing an immediate order for the formal federal investigation of Nathaniel Brooks on charges of deed fraud, falsification of official county records, and conspiracy to obstruct justice," he said. "I am also directing the Territorial Commissioner's Office to open a parallel inquiry into the death of James Whitfield based on the testimony entered today." He looked at Brooks directly for the first time. "Mr. Brooks, you are hereby placed under a federal hold. You will surrender your travel documents to Sheriff Curran before leaving this building. You will make yourself available for further questioning at the direction of this court." Brooks said nothing. His face was the face of a man whose world had been a specific shape for 9 years, and was now a different shape entirely, and who had not yet processed what that meant. Beside him, Prine was already writing, already finding the procedural angles, but his hand had a small tremor that hadn't been there that morning. Furthermore, Harrow said, "All property transfers identified in Miss Whitfield's petition are hereby suspended pending review. Families who lost properties through the transactions documented in this petition will be notified and invited to submit claims." He set down his pen. He looked at Clara. "Miss Whitfield, your father's documentation was exceptional. His work is the foundation of this entire proceeding." A pause. He was not a sentimental man, she could see that, but something in his expression acknowledged weight. "It will be entered into the federal record under his name." Clara pressed her hand flat on her father's notebooks. She nodded once. She could not speak quite, and she didn't try. She simply nodded and let that be enough. Troy. The courtroom emptied slowly, people moving with the particular dazed quality of those who had witnessed something they would spend years describing. and Clara stood at the petitioner's table until most of them had gone, putting her father's notebooks back in the saddlebag with the careful attention she gave them always. She was aware of people stopping to speak to her as they passed. Cal Hendricks gripped her shoulder and said something she felt more than heard. Joey Marsh's father shook her hand with both of his. Martha Holt said, "Your father would have been so proud." And that one she heard clearly, and it landed where it was meant to land. She let it. She was not going to be careful with this. She had been careful with her grief for 8 months, keeping it contained, keeping it functional, keeping it from getting in the way of what needed doing. Today, she was going to let herself feel the full size of it, the loss and the love and the particular pride of a daughter who had finished something her father had started at the cost of his life. She let herself feel all of it. When the room was nearly empty, Ethan came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He picked up one end of the saddlebag, and she let him take it, and they walked out of the courthouse together, into the July morning, and the sun was what it always was in summer, indifferent and generous, at once warming everything equally, and Coldwater Creek was going about its business the way it always had, except that the business was different now, and everyone who lived here knew it. On the courthouse steps, Brooks was surrounded by Curran and 2 deputies, the formal hold being communicated to him in the precise language of legal procedure. He looked old suddenly, which he hadn't looked in the courtroom. He looked like a man whose size had always come from the space other people gave him, and now that the space was closing, there was less of him than anyone had thought. He looked at Clara as she came down the steps. She looked back at him. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that her father's notebooks hadn't already said better. She walked past him. They were sitting on the bench outside the hotel in the shade of the overhang when Sheriff Curran found them an hour later. He stood in front of them with his hat in his hands, the same posture he'd had at her hotel room door, and he said, "Doc Henley is willing to submit a formal affidavit. It'll take a few weeks to go through the territorial process, but it'll go through." He paused. "I'm sorry, Clara, for what happened to your father, for what I didn't do." "You did it today," she said. "That matters." "It should have been sooner." "Yes," she said. "It should have, but it wasn't, and that can't be changed, and what can be changed is what comes next." She looked at him steadily. "What comes next, Dale?" He straightened slightly at his first name. "What comes next is federal investigators in this county for the next several months. What comes next is 8 families getting a fair hearing on their land claims. What comes next is—" He paused. "What comes next is this county having to decide what kind of county it wants to be." "And what kind do you think it will be?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. He almost smiled, and it was a tired smile, the smile of a man who had done the right thing late and was not going to dress that up as heroism. "I think it'll be better than it was," he said. "I think you made sure of that." He walked away. Ethan beside her said nothing for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do?" She looked at the town around her. At the street she'd grown up on the storefront where her father had bought his newspapers, the schoolhouse at the end of the road where she'd spent 3 years teaching other people's children. At the place where the church stood, which she could not quite see from here, but knew was there. "I want to go back to the mountain," she said. He was quiet. "Not to stay, not permanently." She turned to look at him. "I need to see it again. I need to see where all of this started. And I need to think about what comes after." She paused. "I also need to ask you something, and I'd rather ask it up there than down here." "Ask it now," he said. She looked at him. The July sun was full on his face, and he was exactly who he'd been the first day she'd seen him. Battered hat, canvas shirt, that jaw, those gray eyes that held more than they showed. And he was also entirely different because she knew him. Now knew the burn scar on his hand, and the way he went still when he was deciding something, and the look he got when he talked about Thomas, and knowing a person changed what you saw when you looked at them. "Thomas," she said. "You said he's 9. You said he looks like his mother. You said you haven't been to see him in 8 months. She held his gaze. "Bring him home, Ethan. Whatever home looks like. Whether it's the cabin or something else somewhere else, bring him home." She paused. "And I want to be part of that. If you'll let me. Not because you need someone to help with him, but because—" She stopped, found it, said it. "Because when I think about the future now, I think about you in it. And I think about a boy who needs his father, and a father who needs to stop running from the best thing he has left." She took a breath. "That's what I wanted to say." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. She watched everything move through his face, the weight of it, the realness of it, the particular vulnerability of a man who had shut himself away from wanting things for so long that wanting something now felt like standing at the edge of something high. "You know," he said slowly, "for a woman who just spent an hour laying out a federal fraud case, you're also—" "Don't," she said, "don't make it smaller than it is." "I wasn't going to." His voice was quiet. "I was going to say you're the bravest person I've ever watched do anything. And that I have been—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. He looked back at her. "I have been thinking about Thomas every day for 6 years, and not doing enough about it because I didn't know how to be his father while I was still this broken. And somewhere in the last 2 weeks I realized I was wrong about something." "What?" she said. "I was waiting to be unbroken before I came back to life," he said. "But it doesn't work that way. You don't get unbroken first. You come back to life, and the coming back is, what does the mending?" He looked at her with those gray eyes that she was done pretending she wasn't moved by. "You did that, coming back to life, in the middle of the worst stretch of yours." "I had help," she said. "So did I." The bench was warm under them, and the street was alive with the ordinary sounds of a town that was incrementally beginning to be different than it had been, and Clara Whitfield and Ethan Callahan sat in the middle of it and said nothing for a while, because some things settled better in silence. Then Ethan stood up. He held out his hand. She took it. They walked to the livery together, and they got the mare, and they rode north. Hendricks had kept the cabin exactly as they'd left it. He met them at the corral with the particular expression of a man who had been waiting for news and had read most of it already in how they were riding. "It went through," he said. "Not a question." "It went through," Clara said. "Federal inquiry. Your land claim will be reviewed. All 8 cases." Hendricks looked at her for a long moment. He was not a demonstrative man. He had the same mountain stillness that Ethan had, that quality of people who had learned to hold things internally because the world didn't always make room for them, but something moved across his face that was unguarded and real. "James Whitfield," he said. "Just the name." "Yes," Clara said. "He's the reason. He's—" Hendricks nodded. He looked at the ground. He looked back up. "I'll get my things," he said. "Give you the place back." "Wait," Ethan said. "Hendricks, I want to talk to you about something. About the South pasture and whether you'd be interested in running cattle jointly over the next season." He paused. "I've been up here alone for 6 years. I think it's time to start doing something with this land." Hendricks looked at him with the same reassessing expression Clara had seen on Gaines, on Curran, on every person who had encountered Ethan Callahan, expecting the man who had retreated from the world, and found instead the man who had decided to come back to it. "I'd be interested," Hendricks said. "Good," Ethan said. "Let's talk in the morning." That evening, after Hendricks had gone to the barn and the cabin was theirs again, Ethan wrote a letter. He sat at the kitchen table with the same careful attention he gave serious things, and he wrote to his sister-in-law in Colorado. And Clara moved around the kitchen making supper and did not read over his shoulder because some things were private, but she could feel the importance of it in the quality of the silence he wrote in. When he finished, he set the pen down and sat for a moment. "I asked her to bring Thomas up at the end of summer," he said. "If he wants to come." He paused. "I told her there was someone here he should meet." Clara kept her back to him, stirring the pot. She was smiling, and she was fairly sure he could hear it in the silence, even if he couldn't see it. "What did you say about me?" she said. I said you were the most stubborn and capable person I'd met in my life, and that I thought Thomas would like you." She turned around. "That's what you said." He looked at her with those gray eyes. "I also said you were necessary. To me. In ways I was still finding words for." She held his gaze. "That's a good word," she said softly. "Necessary." "I thought so." She served the supper. They ate at the table they'd sat at every evening for 2 weeks, with the wood stove and the shelves and the window going dark with mountain evening, and they talked about small things. The garden Hendricks cattle plan, whether the north fence needed work before fall, and the small things mattered, because they were the texture of a life being built, and Clara had not had a life being built around her in a very long time. After supper, she picked up her father's third notebook. She opened it to the last entry he'd written, which she'd read so many times she could have recited it, but she read it again anyway. "The truth isn't lost. It just needs someone to carry it." She closed the notebook. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she set it on the shelf between Ethan's books, where it fit like it had always been there between a worn farmer's almanac and a battered copy of survey law that Ethan had clearly read many times. She stepped back and looked at it there. "He'd have liked you," she said. To Ethan, to the room, to her father, wherever he was in the particular way the dead are somewhere. "I hope so," Ethan said. "A man like that, I'd have wanted to know him." "You know his work," she said. "That's close." "Close enough," he said. She turned. He was standing by the fireplace, and the fire was low, and the mountain evening was pressing against the windows. And she walked to him because 14 days ago she had walked out of a church and toward a life she hadn't been able to picture yet. And now she could picture it clearly, all the way out to its edges, and it looked like this. It looked like this cabin, and this man, and her father's notebooks on a shelf, and a 9-year-old boy coming at the end of summer, and a federal inquiry working its slow, righteous way through 8 cases of land fraud, and a garden that needed tending, and a south pasture that was going to run cattle, and mornings that started early and quiet and smelled like coffee and mountain air. She walked to Ethan, and he put his arms around her, not dramatically, not as a gesture, just the way you held something. You were done pretending you didn't need, and she let herself be held. And outside the mountain was enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the way of things that had been there long before them, and would be there long after, and none of that diminished this. This was real. This was hers. This was what she had carried her father's truth across 2 counties and through a federal courthouse to earn. Clara Whitfield had walked into that church 3 weeks ago with nothing and a tin box with a broken latch, and she had come out of the other side of the hardest stretch of her life with a man who had given up his bed for her before he'd ever spoken a word to her, and a mountain that was learning to feel like home, and her father's name in the federal record, and every intention of spending the rest of her life being exactly as stubborn and necessary and alive as she knew how to be. She had started this alone. She would not finish it that way. And on the high Montana mountain, in the long gold last light of a July evening, Ethan Callahan held the woman who had ridden into his life on the back of a church crisis and 45 borrowed dollars. And he thought about his son coming at summer's end, and he thought about the south pasture, and he thought about 6 years of mornings he'd faced with nothing ahead of him but more of the same. And then he thought about this morning and what was coming and who was standing here with him, and he understood slowly the way a man understood things. He'd been afraid to want, that the life he'd stopped believing in had not in fact stopped waiting for him. It had simply been waiting for the right person to walk into a church and refuse to leave alone. He held her tighter. She let him. And that between them was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.